Hello, and welcome to FACTS webinar From the Cell to the Rail, the Science of Meat Quality and Yield. Our guest presenter is Jennifer Martin with Colorado State University. I'm Samantha Gasson, FACTS Humane Farming Program Manager, and I will be moderating this session. Thank you for joining us. Before we dive right in, let me take a minute or two to do a few quick introductions. Food Animal Concerns Trust, or FACT, is a national nonprofit organization headquartered in Illinois. We work to ensure that all food-producing animals are raised in a humane and healthy manner. We accomplish this by supporting humane farmers through our humane farming program, promoting policies that make foods and animals safe and healthy to eat through our Safe and Healthy Foods program, and generally help consumers make informed food choices. Please visit our website at foodanimalconcernstrust.org to learn more about our farmer and consumer services. At this time, I am very pleased to introduce our esteemed presenter, Jennifer Martin. Dr. Jennifer Martin is an associate professor in meat safety and quality and meat extension specialist at the Department of Animal Sciences at Colorado State University. Jennifer has an active research program focused on the quality and safety of meat and related products. Her program seeks to explore opportunities and the development of solutions with and for industry partners. In addition to research, Jennifer works closely with meat and livestock food industry members across Colorado and the nation. Notably, she is the coordinator of the Pet Food Alliance, a collaborative industry organization, excuse me, focused on exploring solutions for the pet food and rendering industries. She also serves as the co-leader for the Upskilling Initiative, a workforce development and innovative educational program within the College of Agricultural Sciences, which seeks to provide novel career pathways for agro-food industries. She also plays an active role in on-campus programs, including the Provost Council for Engagement, Faculty Council, and numerous department and university committees. She's very busy. In addition to her university work, Jennifer is actively involved in numerous livestock organizations across the country. Jennifer and her husband, Chad, and their dog, Mel, live in Timnath, Colorado. Is that it? Timnath? So I'm actually very excited to have Rachel here today. I first heard Rachel give not Rachel. I don't know why I said Rachel. Jennifer. Sorry, Jennifer. I was really excited to. I listened to her presentation at a conference here in North Carolina. I think it was last year, and I knew as soon as we got maybe 10 minutes into it, I was like, oh, we have to do this as a FACT webinar because there was so much great information. So then I followed her around for the rest of the conference until I had the nerve to ask her. So anyway, so it was a little bit of work getting her here, not on her part. She said yes immediately, but still, it was a little work on my part. So we're very, very lucky to have you, Jennifer. Thank you so much. All right, and without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over to you. Jennifer, if you would like to, please take it away.
Thanks so much. I'm really excited to be here today and love the opportunity to talk about this topic. So thankful for another chance to share what I think is some really fascinating information around the development of high quality and high yielding meat animals. And in some cases, I think the science that we'll talk about today can get really complex, but we're going to try to keep it where it's applicable to those of you who are listening either live with us this afternoon or who are watching the recording. So our goal today is to really discuss how biology and physiology impact the production performance, as well as carcass quality, acceptance, and yield. And we think about why this is important. I interact a lot with students, and as you might suspect, many students don't think of meat science as a career option. So we often talk about why we should care at all about meat quality or meat yield. And so I want you to think for a second, if you will, and it's getting near lunchtime here in Colorado, but I want you to think for a second about what a high quality meat eating experience might look like for you. Right? So think wherever you're at, whatever that is to you, what does it mean when you think of high quality meat eating experience? And for me, for example, I'm getting a little hungry. So maybe it's the burger on the bottom right. Maybe it's a steak. Maybe it's a pork chop. Maybe it's a roast, whatever it is. And what is our ultimate goal with that high quality eating experience? is to deliver that to a consumer so that that consumer enjoys the experience enough where they'll come back and consume the same product again. They'll tell their friends, they'll write reviews, all of the things that we know that keep the meat industry in business and make sure that we're profitable from an industry perspective. We're desiring to give a consumer an eating experience that they enjoy so much so that they'll continue to desire that experience. That's our ultimate target. And that's why we focus a lot on quality. From a yield perspective, it's also important because there's certainly the profitability piece at that angle as well. So I want to ask you a quick question though. If that's our if that's our goal, we know we're a target. Why haven't we figured out an easier way to get there? So if we know ultimately when every time we produce a beef animal, every time we produce a pig, a sheep, a goat, whatever meat producing animal it is, if we know that our ultimate target is to produce that meat animal in a space and in a way that when we harvest that animal, it's yielding a carcass that is high yield, as well as high quality so that that consumer has a desirable eating experience and they want it again. Why can't we do that every time? Or why haven't we figured out a really tried and true or a recipe, if you will, for how to do that every time? And the reason why is it's a really complicated science that impacts how the animal is raised and how the animal responds to the things we do. And as you all who produce animals know, it's an art as well. So balancing that art as well as the complexities of the science is a really large challenge. And understanding that balance and perfecting that balance is how we are able to deliver high quality, high yielding animals for consumers as well as for ourselves to make sure that our businesses are profitable. So in order to produce high quality meat, it helps us to understand some of the science that influences muscle, fat, and skeletal development. It also helps us understand some of the variables that influence carcass performance, as well as the eating quality of the meat that's coming from that carcass. And so I often say, as the title alluded to, that building high quality meat starts at the cellular level and ends at the rail. And arguably it ends beyond the rail, right? As it's going to a restaurant or to a consumer's home. There are pieces after the rail where we see those impacts also happen. But if we focus on the piece from when the animal first starts development all the way until the rail, every single step in that process is going to have an impact on the eating quality of the meat as well as the yield of the carcass. And so today's presentation is going to walk us through at a very high level some of those processes so that we have a better understanding of not only the processes themselves or the timing of those processes, but different things that impact them. So we'll take a look at what are some things that impact fat development, for example, or muscular development. How does the development of either of those impact yield and or quality? And so when we think about this, if we focus on that cell to the rail, if we think about muscle, fat, and bone specifically, they all start as cells. And so you see 3 cell types there, and this is for any of you who've taken biology, maybe this is a refresher on that. If you've gone to the doctor, maybe you've heard these words before. On the left-hand side, we have myocytes, and those are muscle cells. So this is what muscle looks like before it turns into the muscles that we associate with either our own bodies or those of animals. So myocytes are the building blocks of muscle. There in the middle, we have mesenchymal stem cells and adipocytes. These are the building blocks of fat. So these are the cells from a human perspective we don't find super desirable, but from an animal perspective, we do find a lot of value in these cells, and understanding how they develop and the timing of their development is really important, as we'll see in a bit. So adipocytes, building blocks of fat. And then lastly, we have the fibroblasts, which are the building blocks of the skeleton as well as the skeletal structures. And collectively, these cells accumulate into masses that are associated with either carcass yield or carcass quality. And understanding how they develop and the timing of which by which they develop is really important for having a feel for what's going on during the lifetime of the animal. And I think, as you'll see, we tend to focus on the lifetime of the animal from birth to harvest, but what we'll see today is the lifetime of the animal actually starts well before that, and the development of these cells particularly, which have impacts on yield and quality, start well before birth. And understanding that piece and the role that some of the other variables may play in development of an embryo as well as development of offspring are really helpful. Let's first start with skeletal development and spend some time talking about the science of how bones develop. High quality meat animals begin with good skeletal structure. So similar to the foundation of a house, we must have good bones. And the reason why we must have good bones to build high yielding, high quality meat animals is meat is skeletal muscle. And as the name would imply, skeletal muscle relies on the skeleton, and the bones serve as levers for those skeletal muscles. So if we have weak bones, we also have weak muscles. So in order for us to develop strong, large, high yielding carcasses, we must have good bones. In order for us to develop muscles that can support fat development, we must also have good bones. And so skeletal development oftentimes is overlooked because we think of the bones or the skeleton of a carcass as not something that adds a lot of value when the animal's harvested, but during the development process, it really does lay the foundation for everything else that does have very direct relevance to yield and or quality. We also know that skeletal structures form prenatally or before birth. And so at birth, whether it's a human or a calf or a piglet, the bone to skeleton or the bone to tissue ratio is really high. And at birth, we usually see it's about 2 to 1. We have lots of bone and relatively little other body mass. But what happens as we grow is our body mass increases. And for some time, especially early in development, that skeletal mass is also increasing. But over time, the skeletal mass growth stops and our lean tissue mass, our fat mass, keeps growing. And so as an animal ages, that ratio decreases, and specifically it increases as the animal grows both in weight as well as in size. Now, nutrition, the use of the animal, hormones that the animal is exposed to, management of the animal can also influence skeletal development and bone growth. So there is a lot of research that suggests animals that are raised in open pastures versus animals that are raised in small pens have different types and different rates of skeletal growth. We also know that animals, just like humans, need a strong nutritional foundation for bones to develop. So animals that may be ill or injured early in their development, or since most of these skeletal structures form prenatally, mothers that are carrying animals and the mom gets sick, that can impact as well skeletal muscle growth and development. We've seen changes as it relates to the exposure to hormones, whether that be natural hormones or synthetic hormones being exposed to the animal can influence skeletal growth and development. And then again, use, how that animal is using those bones. If they're moving around a lot in an open pasture, or if they're not moving much, might impact the development of those bones and may impact the strength of the bones specifically. We know that after the animal is born, so postnatal skeletal growth, that is generally considered to be an increase in length of bones. So at that point in time, we don't see much increase in diameter. It's a marginal increase compared to the increase in length. So think about it this way. Think about the ways in which our bones grow as humans after we're born, right? We tend to get taller, and for some period of time, our bones will get wider and stronger, but the length of bone continues to increase until about puberty. That same thing happens with animals, and that their bones grow longitudinally. They're getting longer, not always getting wider. So early on in development, we're forming the strength of the bone, and then we see the bone get longer as the animal continues to grow. So you may ask again, if we're talking about meat, why do we care about bones? The skeletal system again creates that foundation for muscle development. And as bones grow longitudinally, so as they're increasing in length, muscles also grow in length. So muscles are growing at the same time that our bones are growing. And the rate of bone growth impacts the rate of muscle growth. So if we see animals that have a large frame size, we tend to see with those animals a faster rate of lean meat growth. So they're getting big fast, their muscles are growing fast, but those muscles aren't, at the same time, as we'll see later on, aren't always able to deposit marbling or fat in between those muscle cells. So we see with fast growing, large frame size animals, oftentimes a lot of lean muscle development, but oftentimes that lean muscle tissue isn't the high quality muscle tissue that we like to see on the rail. We also know that because of that, again, large frame animals produce leaner meats. There's a balance there that we see with genetics. So there are certain breeds of animals, specifically if we think about beef cattle, that are known to produce larger frame sizes. There's balancing the genetic impact with the rate of growth and the nutrition. So there's a fine line of when that genetic impact takes, or weans off and the nutritional plane that the animal's on takes over, so we can overcome animals that are predisposed to be leaner meat, larger framed. Can we overcome that with nutrition? And we'll talk a bit more about that later on today. Let's talk a bit, though, next about muscle. And this tends to be what we focus on a lot, and perhaps even more in a second, we focus on fat development more so than muscle development. But just like skeletal development begins prenatally, muscle development begins really early in gestation. And this is a really key piece that I think is important for everyone to know as it relates to the development of muscle cells. And that's that the number of skeletal muscle cells is largely set by the last month of pregnancy. And that applies for humans as well. And what that means is when you are born, or when a calf or pig or sheep or goat or turkey or chicken is born, at birth, the number of muscle cells they will ever have is largely determined at that time. And that development happened prior to birth. So once they're born, they're not going to gain any additional muscle cells. What happens after birth, as you see in that second bullet point, is the muscles begin to grow in size, not in number. So at birth, the number of cells is set, and after birth, we see those individual cells start to grow in size and start to organize into individual muscles. So what that means, I often joke with my students, what that means for a human is that I can't take muscle pills and get more muscle cells. All I can do as a human, especially post-birth, is to take do things to increase the size of my muscles. So working out, exercising, things like that from a human perspective. That same mantra applies for animals. At birth, number of muscle cells is set. After birth, all we can do is grow those muscle cells in size. So what does that mean when you think about this? Let's take a step back. If muscle cell number is largely set by the time an animal is born, that means that prenatal factors play a huge role in muscle development. So things that happen to the mom during pregnancy impact the development of muscle cells in her calf or her offspring. So let's say, for example, that there was poor nutrition during gestation. That can yield, if we're talking about a cow, can yield a calf that is light muscling and will yield a low yielding carcass. It may also mean that illnesses during gestation may impact the development of muscles in the offspring. And so paying particular attention to gestational nutrition and gestational health has a major impact on muscle growth, because muscles can't grow if the cells aren't there. So even if we pour all of the groceries, if you will, at the animal after they're born, if the muscle cells were never formed during gestation, it doesn't matter. They're not going to be able to grow muscle and will result in what you see as a low yielding light muscle carcass. So management of pregnant females, particularly in that mid-gestational period, is really highly correlated with muscling and highly correlated with high yielding and heavily muscled carcasses. Let's talk a bit about what happens after birth with muscles, particularly some of the changes that may impact meat quality. So when an animal is born early on, most of the muscle development. So again, at birth, muscle number is determined. They have a finite number of muscle cells. Post-birth, we see development of those muscle cells. So muscles start to differentiate given on how they're used and where they're located after birth. At birth, that development and differentiation really is focused on the very small muscles that are associated with the skeleton. And when you think about it for a second, it makes sense, right? Because at that point in time, from a physiological perspective, the animal's focus isn't on producing a carcass, it's on survival. And so we see development and differentiation of muscles that are necessary for survival. So muscles with a skeleton that are helpful for movement, muscles that are associated with the respiratory system, the cardiovascular system, the gastrointestinal system, we see those muscles really start to differentiate and start to develop some characteristics. After that, once the skeletal muscles, the small muscles first, because they're helpful with organization of the bones and supporting the bones, as the animal begins to grow and mature, we start to see changes in bone and muscles that are associated with movement more so than support of the skeleton. The development that we see, the differentiation that we see among those muscles usually reflects, again, how the muscle is used. So is it used for support of the skeleton? Is it used for locomotion? The location of the muscle. So is it something that's associated with a limb versus something that's associated with the body or the thorax of the animal? We also know that differentiation of those muscles and the development of the muscles is not a level playing field, and it changes depending on the nutritional plane, the breed type, again, the use and location of the muscle. But at birth, most of the muscle fibers are what we call this type 1 muscle fiber. So a couple of things, and we're not going to get into detail with the science here, but a couple of things that are important for you to know. These type 1 muscle fibers tend to be really red in color, and they tend to have a high fat content. And that's important because these are muscle fibers that are important for survival. So most of our muscle fibers start as type 1. As the animal ages, we start to see the emergence of these other 2 muscle fiber types. A couple of things to know about these these other 2 fiber types. Notice that their fat content changes. So that's why certain muscles, if we think about a carcass, certain muscles can have lots of marbling and others cannot. They never will, because they don't have the propensity or the capacity. They're these type 2X muscle fibers. Other muscles may be darker or more red or more pink in color, especially if we think about red meat species, because they have a higher presence of myoglobin compared to the type 2X muscle fibers. So the differentiation of muscles, determining which one of these 2 they will be, is a reflection of how it's used, the location of the muscle, the breed type of the animal, and again, the nutritional plane. And this happens as the animal matures or as the animal ages, and as we start to see a movement away from muscle development solely for the purposes of survival and organization of the skeleton, and towards a maturing, moving animal that has some of the characteristics that we may associate with weaning and post-weaning ages. So
Jennifer,
what? Yeah, go ahead.
Can I ask a quick question? Could you give an example of muscle types or cuts of meat that would be each one of those types? Would you mind doing that?
Yeah, great question. So we think about, so if we look at type 2A versus type 2X, those are probably some of the more common, or type 1A, which is pretty similar to type 2A. A good example of a type 2A muscle is here on the bottom. This is a psoas major, or the tenderloin. So a couple of things that we see here. Notice the tenderloin has high lipid content. It's a cut that can really, really marble. It also tends to be darker in color and has more, it stays red. Compared to these type 2X muscles, we see these a lot in muscles that are associated with the limbs. So on a beef animal, either the chuck or the round, those muscles, certain of them do marble really well, but on the whole, they just do not have enough potential to hold on to or support the growth of the fat cells. So we often see their lipid content to be pretty high. There are also muscles that when you think about going to the grocery store, or the muscles that you may harvest from your own animals, they tend to be a lighter red color for the red meat animals because they have a lower myoglobin content. Great question, though.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, so let's talk about why those things matter. So a couple of reasons why it's important for us to understand first when muscle cells develop, right? So we talked about muscle cell development happens prenatally, and that things that happen during gestation may impact the presence of muscle cells at birth. And if the muscle cells aren't there, they can't grow. So that's step 1 as to why understanding muscle development is really important. As it relates to muscle fiber type, it's also important for us to understand briefly why muscles act differently. So we said they act differently based on how they're used or where they're located or the nutritional plane. But why is that important? Why is it important for us to know that, why does a tenderloin act differently than a round steak? Or why does a ribeye steak act differently than a chuck roast? And some of the reasons are those muscle fiber type descriptors that we just talked about. That's going to impact most immediately the rate of pH decline. So some things that we know happen at harvest, the pH of the carcass must drop. And the pH must drop for all of the things that we associate with high quality meat to occur. So for that tenderization to happen, for some of the things we associate with flavor development, in order for those things to happen, the pH after an animal is harvested must drop inside of the muscle. And that happens differently depending on what muscle fiber type or what muscle location or use we're talking about. We also know that marbling, like we talked about, there's a greater amount of marbling in type 1 fibers and those type 2A fibers than there are in muscles that have type 2X fibers. So that's why we place a lot of value on the middle meats, because those muscles particularly can marble really, really well. They're type 1 and type 2A compared to muscles of the chuck and the round in a beef animal, or the ham and the shanks in like a pig, for example. Those muscle fibers, it doesn't matter how much excess nutrition we give that animal, those muscle fibers physiologically and biologically cannot marble at the same level that the loin or the tenderloin can. So it's important for you to understand, why are they acting differently and why do they have such different characteristics? We also know that the muscle use impacts the tenderness of the animal. And this is really intuitive when you think about it. Think about cuts of an animal from the middle, or middle meats, if you will, tenderloin, ribeye, strip steak for a beef animal, compared to things from the limbs. When muscles are used for movement or locomotion, they tend to have more connective tissue, and they tend to have fiber types that are associated with more tough muscles, compared to muscles that are used for support, which tend to be more tender than muscles used for locomotion. And we talked about how those muscle fiber types differentiate in their ability to have a strong, bright red color for red meat animals compared to a more pale color. So all of those fiber type things that we talked about, all of those different variables, and we didn't touch on all of them, but each and every single one of them influences a property that is associated with quality, right? Whether it's associated with tenderness or juiciness or flavor, or it's associated with color as it relates to the visual quality of the cut produced from the animal. So it's important, again, to understand not only what's happening from a developmental stage, but as those muscle fibers start to behave differently based on where they're located and where they're used, what is the impact of that? And why do certain muscles behave differently than others? And it really reflects at the cellular level what's going on when those muscles begin to differentiate. Let's talk for a second about fat development. And this is one that I joke a lot, because from a human perspective, the more I learned about fat development, I was a little disappointed in some of the things that I learned. But the more I learned during my research about fat development, the more some of the things that we see in practice from an animal production perspective make sense, and maybe gave more information on how we can manage how fat is developed, but also how we can maximize fat development into metrics that are helpful from a quality perspective. So let's talk about, again, development of fat cells. Lipid cells, fat cells develop late in gestation and early in the postnatal period. So a little different. We talked about skeletal cells early in gestation. Fat cells were mid-gestation, and now we're ending the gestational period and early postnatal period. We see the development of marbling cells. The development of fat cells or lipid cells really follows a very sequential order. And this order doesn't differentiate much between species. We do see some differentiation within species among breeds. It's pretty marginal, but overall we see visceral fat, so internal fat, develop first. And again, it goes back to, this animal isn't intended to produce a carcass. This animal, as these cells are developing, is just trying to survive. And so the development of visceral fat is intended to protect the organs. So that's the first type of fat that develops. Second to that fat, we see the fat developing on the exterior of the carcass, that subcutaneous fat directly beneath the skin. That fat develops second. And then the third and fourth stages of fat development first are intermuscular. So that would be what we commonly refer to as seam fat, so fat in between groups of muscles. And then marbling, which is intramuscular fat. So intra meaning in between those muscle cells. This is the type of fat that's desirable. All of the other fat, one, that necessary fat for animal survival, but subcutaneous fat and intermuscular fat or seam fat really don't add a whole lot of value as it relates to the carcass, right? Those are fat products that are trimmed off. The fat itself has lesser value than the lean muscle. So one of the caveats of producing animals, as you all know, is that oftentimes in order to get to marbling, you have to spend a lot of time developing fat that's not going to add value. And it's pretty rare when we find animals that have a lower level of subcutaneous fat or seam fat and a high level of marbling. It happens, but it's pretty rare. let's take a look for a minute, if you will, at the timeline of fat development. So this particular graph focuses on a beef animal. And so from conception to slaughter, the blue bars are the fats, or this is the development of the fat cells themselves. So this is what we call fat cell hyperplasia, and that's an increase in the number of cells. And we would also say that if we're increasing muscle cells or skeletal cells. So anytime we see hyperplasia, we're increasing the number. Compared to the red bar, which focuses on hypertrophy. So anytime we see hypertrophy, we're increasing the size. So when the bar is blue, increasing the number, we're developing the fat cells. When the bar is red, we're increasing the size of those fat cells that are developed. So let's take a look at the entire lifespan of an animal from conception to slaughter. Notice from soon after conception till right after birth, we start to see the development of those fat cells, right? So we're right after birth. As we start to age the animal, right before weaning, as we're early calfhood, we're switching away from developing those cells to growing the cells that have developed. And after birth through slaughter, we're just increasing the size of fat cells. Now, in some cases, we do see new fat cell development, but the majority of fat depositing is actual growth in existing cells, not the growth of new cells or the development of new cells. If we focus specifically on intramuscular fat, so marbling, notice that marbling cells act a little bit different. Marbling cells really begin to form at birth, and arguably a little before birth do we see the development of marbling cells. And right around weaning, as it relates to a calf, we switch from the development of those cells to the growth of those cells. And the most growth of those cells happens late in the finishing phase. So that a calf or a mature animal spends a lot of its time of its life developing cells, and then a very small, relatively small piece of its life increasing the size of those cells. So this tells us that a lot of times when we focus on increasing fatness, we have to make sure that the cells were developed even to begin with. If the fat cells were never developed, then it doesn't matter how much energy we put into a ration or how much energy we put into a diet, they can never grow. They're not there. So making sure that animals have an adequate plane of nutrition, having adequate health is important for those cells to develop, because if not, we see lots of problems where at the end of the finishing period, whereas we're nearing the end of the finishing period, we're feeding an animal, and we're not seeing the return in carcass quality or the return in intramuscular fat because the cells were never there to begin with. So given what we know about marbling and the role that marbling plays in quality in the eating experience, there has been a lot of research that's gone into understanding how intramuscular fat is developed, right? It's important for us to know overall what happens with fat, what's happening with the development of visceral fat, seam fat, subcutaneous fat. That's really important. But most of the research has really focused on what's going on here, because what's going on here is impacting the value of that carcass and impacting the consumer's eating experience. So oftentimes we ask folks, with this information as it applies to you, if marbling cells are being developed early or late in the gestational period, right before birth, all the way until about weaning, what's happening in your production systems that may be impacting the development of marbling cells, right? What's going on that may, if it's not working well, if you're finishing animals, but they're not reaching the quality targets that you have, is there something happening in this period that could be deterring the actual development of the cells? And again, I say this a lot, and I've said it a few times today, but if the cells aren't there, it does not matter how much energy we add into their diet. It does not matter what we do. The cells can't get bigger if they don't exist. And if at the end of the finishing period, our only way of making sure that we're getting marbling is to grow cells that are there, we have to be really sure that they developed in the first place. And so it's important for us to understand what we're doing as producers from a management perspective to control this. And if it's not working, why isn't it? And what's going on in this space that could be detracting from the development of those cells? Now, I throw this, oh, go ahead, sorry.
Jennifer, yeah, I think we have a couple of questions that might be good to be, might be good being answered now rather than waiting till the end. And then there's another couple, just if I don't ask them, it's not because I don't think they're good questions, guys. It's just that I think that they probably be better questions at the end. So we have a question about muscle fiber types and the three muscle fiber types you were talking about. Are they present in poultry and rodents, in particular rabbits, or I guess lagomorphs and other red meats?
Yeah, great question. So we do see all muscle fiber types in those species. Primarily with poultry, we see a lot of the type 2X fibers. I'm not as familiar with rabbits, but I know for other small stock, it's a differentiation that's similar to what we would see in red meat animals. So the fiber types are there. In white meat animals, it tends to be more on the type 2X side. Good question, though.
And there's another question about goats. And Catherine asks, I understand that goats put on fat externally to the muscle, not internally marbling. Could you talk about that difference and how it affects meat quality?
Yeah, great question. So the development of marbling in goats is hard. They can develop marbling, but it takes a long time and takes a lot of excess energy because of how they metabolize their diets. What that usually means is that we have goat meat that is relatively lean compared to lamb or beef, pork, so on and so forth. And so from a quality perspective, it means that those animals are starting out at a deficit as it relates to intramuscular fat. That deficit is not, you can't overcome it, right? It may change the way in which we cook or prepare those meats, but it does reflect the physiology and the physiological processes of the animal.
And then there's Janet commented, so marbling comes down to mama cow nutrition. And yeah, Janet, that's the thing I got out of this the first time I listened to it. It just blew me away. It was amazing.
Yeah, it is really, when we don't think about gestational management often as it relates to the development of the offspring, and it's important for skeleton. So, if we start at the very beginning, they can't have marbling if they don't have good bones, because they can't have muscle if they don't have good bones. So mama cow nutrition is essential. And when we see things happening from a cow perspective, or any mother, when we see things happening during gestation, we see those impacts in the offspring, but oftentimes we don't realize the impact that they have on the carcass. So we may see those impacts as it relates to weaning stress or weaning or growth of the animal. But, when you're thinking about the lifetime of the animal, it's really hard when you're at harvest. You're like, well, gosh, I can't get this animal to finish. Or I'm feeding it and it's not really putting on muscle. We don't go back and think, well, yeah, because when the mom was pregnant with this animal, she was sick, or she, it was a drought year and she didn't have access to high quality hay or whatever it may be. And those impacts are significant. And so when we think, I joke a lot about the role of moms with this presentation should be reinforced, right? The role of moms in taking care of themselves and taking care of their offspring has widespread impacts throughout the lifetime of the animal, and certainly those impacts are seen at the carcass level. So take care of mama cows and mama pigs and mama sheep and goats, because it certainly impacts the quality of the carcass at the end.
All right, thank you, Jennifer. I think the other two can wait till the end.
Okay, perfect. So we use this slide here at the end not to get overly complicated, but I think it's important for us to take a step back and understand the complexity of what's happening. We talked early on, if you envision that high quality meat eating experience, it seems like it should be really simple. We know the target. We know we want to deliver the really tender and flavorful and juicy steak. We want to deliver the pork chop that folks find incredibly desirable and will go back and eat again, or the really nice beef burger there on the bottom right, or whatever meat it is. We want to deliver that. And that seems like it should be more simple than it is. And we know that for those of you who produce animals, that the art that you do is really a complicated and a delicate art, but underpinning that art is a really complicated science. And so one of the reasons why it's so challenging and it's so gratifying and it's such a valuable experience when you do it right is it's managing a lot of different variables. And in some cases you have control of those variables, in other cases you don't. You're managing the outputs of them. So it really emphasizes, I think, this slide, that building high quality meat starts at that cellular level and it ends at the rail. And it's every step of the process along the way, whether it's the skeleton that started really early at the conception, our muscle cell development started mid-gestation, and fat development that starts early in gestation and goes all the way until slaughter. Every single step and time period in the animal's life is important for maximizing quality and yield. And let's transition a bit into kind of the next phase of this. So we understand the foundation. We have an animal that has a good skeletal structure. We're starting to develop a muscle, and we're starting to, it has all of the things it needs to develop a high yielding, high quality carcass. So the foundation is built. Now what do we do? What's happening as that animal is born? We have all of the development happen prenatally occurred. Now the animal's born. What happens next? And some of the things relative to what happens postnatally are a reflection of nutrition. So genetics have a large role in a gestational propensity, right? What the animal can do, the nutrition of the mama cow is playing a role there. But after that animal's born, it's really a combination of genetics and nutrition. And as an animal matures, the same thing applies for humans. Less of our energy is directed towards growing muscle, and more of that energy is directed towards depositing fat. And we can all say this from personal experience, right? There was a time in life where putting on muscle was really easy. I am past that age now. Now it's much easier to put on fat than it is to put on muscle. It's much, not many of us, perhaps none of us, are getting taller. So we've stopped depositing bone, and our bones have stopped growing. So as an animal ages, first we see muscle growth start to outpace bone growth. And then as they continue to mature, fat growth starts to outpace muscle growth. And so at the end of the life cycle, we really see a stagnant level of bone development, where bones develop really quickly and then stagnate. And then we see fat take off pretty heavily here at the end, where muscle starts to slow down. We also know, as it relates to fat development, or the growth of fat, or the depositing of fat, is it's energy inefficient. So when I say energy inefficient, it means that it takes a lot of energy to deposit fat. And when you think about that from a human perspective, it's the same as it is for animals. It makes sense. The foods that we eat first make sure that our basal metabolic needs are covered, right? So we're taking care of our organs, we're taking care of the body systems. So animals, humans, cattle, sheep, pigs, goats, rabbits, chickens, whatever, their primary focus is survival. And so nutritionally, same thing happens. All of the energy we intake must first meet our basic nutritional needs to cover homeostasis of the body. After that, we see maintenance of muscle, maybe some muscle growth, depending on the age of the animal. And it's only with the excess energy. So after everything else is taken care of, then we see animals start to deposit fat. And then we also said that deposition of fat follows that sequential order. So first we have visceral fat, then we have subcutaneous fat, intermuscular seam fat, and at the very, very end, we have intramuscular fat, or marbling. So what that means is it takes a lot of energy to establish marbling, or to start to develop and grow marbling. It takes an excess of energy. We have to have more than enough calories, or more than enough groceries is the term that I often use. So I relate this back to, I have a brother who's pretty tall, and when we were growing up, you may have something similar in your families. You have a person who is so tall, it seems like no matter what you feed them, they will not put on weight, right? It's impossible to make them gain fat, or it's impossible to make them get heavier, because the amount of calories they need to just fuel their body is so high, or their metabolism is so high, we never reach that excess energy phase. Same thing happens as it relates to marbling development. It takes a lot to get there. We know that they'll only deposit it after their basic nutritional needs are met. We know that in large framed animals, those nutritional needs are higher. They're bigger. It takes more to fuel their body. So it takes even more energy and even more calories for them to deposit intramuscular fat. We know that certain breeds of animals tend to have a faster metabolism, just like certain people have faster metabolism. They also require more energy or more calories to deposit fat. We know that animals, you may have experienced this, animals that are high strung or highly active, they take a lot of calories an excess of calories to deposit that intramuscular fat. So the only way that we get to marbling is making sure that everything else is taken care of and that everything else is met. Then we see all of that excess eventually be applied to marbling. So the question about goats, metabolically, goats take a high excess. So you can get there. I've seen it happen, but it's really, really hard to see intramuscular fat development in that, given the metabolism of those animals. So let's talk about a few things that impact meat quality, specifically as it relates to the eating experience a consumer has. If we go back to what the target is and making sure that consumers enjoy their eating experience and want to repeat it again. After birth, the challenge that we face is literally everything can impact meat quality. So the nutrition and composition of the diet. I just talked about the stress of the animals. If animals are high strung or they're highly stressed or have a really fast metabolism, then maybe that keeps them from depositing enough energy to deposit fat. Exposure to hormones, supplements, environmental conditions, all of these things, plus a host of others. There are so many different variables after birth that can influence growth and meat quality. One of the ones that we focus on a lot, though, is the bullet there at your top. And so when we think about nutrition and composition of the diet, we know that these things impact the eating experience. We know that these things may impact the composition of the animal, or they may impact the growth of the animal in some respects. But why is that? Why does nutrition play a role in meat quality? And why does nutrition play a role in the growth of an animal? And I like to, often, probably because I deal with young folks often, I relate this to the human experience. Imagine for a second, if you will, that for the next year, you had a diet consisting only of Twinkies. Okay. Imagine what you might look like a year from now compared to if you had a diet that was more balanced. You had some protein, some vegetables, some grains, a much more balanced diet than one that was comprised of Twinkies. You would look arguably different than if you only consumed Twinkies for the next year. And your look, the different look that you had is a reflection of the different composition. So arguably your body fat percentage might be higher if you had a diet of only Twinkies. Your muscle, if you're not consuming protein, the ratio of muscle to bone or muscle to fat might be lower because you're not growing muscle cells if you have a diet of only Twinkies. So nutrition influences composition. We know this from our own experiences, right? If I eat a diet of Twinkies, I'm going to be compositionally different than if I eat a more balanced diet. It also is the same as it relates to beef animals or sheep or goats or pork or whatever it may be. Nutrition plays a role in composition. So in its simplest form, it's going to play a role in the balance of fat to lean. If we have a diet that has excess calories, excess energy, it's easier for us to deposit fat. First, the fat that is not desirable, the subcutaneous fat that's trimmed off, the seam fat that's in between muscles. But we also see the fat that's in between the muscle cells, or the intramuscular fat that is desirable from a meat quality perspective. And that's different from this animal compositionally, right? So they're both meat animals, but one has less fat to lean. The other has more fats compared to the amount of lean that it has. This one also has less intramuscular fat. And in this particular case, one of the ways in which they arrive to this point, or can arrive to this point, is a reflection of the composition of the diet. This animal may simply have not had enough groceries. So if we assume that all things were fine gestationally and they had all of the muscle and fat cell development they needed, but they didn't have enough excess energy to grow that subcutaneous fat or to deposit that intramuscular fat as a reflection of their diet. So composition of the diet can influence composition of the animal. We know, as we talked about earlier, that deposition of intramuscular fat requires an excess of energy. And that excess of energy, historically, one of the ways that we've been able to have more confidence in reaching that excess in the cattle industry, particularly, is by feeding grain-based feedstuffs. Now, we know that's not the only way to achieve that excess energy required for marbling, but it is historically one of the more common ways to achieve the excess energy or the high energy diet needed to deposit marbling. We know then that excess energy is used in fat deposition or intramuscular fat deposition particularly. Again, it can be obtained through forage-based or other diets, but the composition of the forage can impact the composition of the fat. So when we think about composition, we often think about it being this way. It's the ratio of fat to lean, and that's one type of composition. We can get this one on the left, whether we're feeding grain or grass. What differs, though, when we're feeding grain or grass is the composition of the fat itself. When we're feeding grain, the composition is relatively consistent across all grain-fed animals. But when you think about forages, are all forages the same? And the answer is no, right? When I think about where I'm from originally in Texas, the composition of forage in the summer is very different there than the composition of forage where I live now in Colorado. And would I expect the composition then of the animals being fed those diets to be exactly the same? And the answer is no. Even though the caloric intake may be roughly similar and the gross composition of those animals may be roughly similar, the fat itself will be very different, or can be very different if the forage is very different. Similarly, if we were to think about grass-fed or forage-finished animals in the US compared to Australia, or to New Zealand or Eastern Europe, or wherever part of the globe we want to discuss, if the composition of forage is different, it can influence the composition of fat. And the composition of fat is associated with flavor. And so that's one of the reasons why when we think about quality, we talk about gross composition. So how much fat is there? Do they have enough energy to deposit marbling? And if we can check yes, that's one step of the equation. But what if the composition of the fat changes in a way that is undesirable? Well, how does that happen? How can fat be different? And how can fat be so different that in some cases it's undesirable? And that really relates to some of the chemical building blocks of fat. And so we know fat, lipids, are comprised of fatty acids, and there are different types of fatty acids. I'm not going to get into a food chemistry lesson this afternoon, but certain types of fatty acids are associated with good flavors. Other types of fatty acids are associated with bad flavors or undesirable flavors. And when we take those fatty acids, or we take those building blocks, and it's fatty acids plus protein plus minerals and vitamins and all of those things, and we add heat, so we cook, we produce new compounds on the right-hand side. And these new compounds, in some cases, are associated with desirable or undesirable flavors. Now, if we have a compound on this side that reflects a certain type of forage, that compound is going to reflect an undesirable flavor on this side as well. So in its simplest form, composition really just determines yield, dressing percentage, quality grade. But as we go beyond that and peel the onion layer one bit lower, the composition also influences the eating experience. So composition of the fat matters just as much as composition of the carcass matters from a pure lean to fat ratio. So when we take a steak, and we take a raw steak and we cook it, we end up with this desirable steak here on the right-hand side, but the flavor profiles may be incredibly different given the composition of the diet. So even if it had enough calories, had enough excess energy to deposit the marbling and get all of the fat, the eating experience may not be desirable if the composition of the diet was included or inclusive of forages that lead to undesirable flavors. So why does composition matter? As we explore alternative feedstuffs, we really need to understand their contributions to meat quality. So it's not as simple as just making sure they have enough. It's also understanding the composition of those forages and the impacts they have on the eating experience a consumer might have. And not all feedstuffs, not all forages specifically, are created equal. There are certain forages that are known to produce undesirable flavors. Now, depending on when you expose an animal to those forages, you can overcome that, right? But if you're exposing an animal to undesirable forages that are associated with undesirable flavors at the end of the finishing period, you may see challenges as it relates to the eating experience a consumer has. So as
Jennifer,
we think about, yeah, go ahead.
Could you give some examples of those forages?
It varies a lot depending on parts of the country that you're in. So I know, here in Colorado, very different than Texas. I was giving a talk similar to this to some folks on the East Coast last month or a couple of months ago, and the forages that are associated with undesirable flavors there are very different than the ones that are associated here. So I would encourage folks who have that question to reach out to their to a nutritional extension person within their university system, or to reach out to others around them, because it's usually something that is incredibly regional and folks know what it is because they've had experiences with it. So I don't want to speak specifically because there are lots that and it varies quite regionally. But great question, and it's one that I would encourage folks to ask what bad experiences those in their area have had with certain forages, so that they can avoid them.
Thank you.
So it's imperative as we think about building, again, that ultimate goal of delivering a high quality eating experience, to evaluate the nutritional composition of whatever feedstuff we're using. So on the grain-based side, they're fairly consistent. On anything that's non-grain, understanding the composition and its impact on eating quality and eating, or the composition of the carcass, is really important. So first question would be, does it meet the maintenance needs? So again, to reiterate, marbling doesn't happen unless those maintenance needs are met. So if we're exploring different feedstuffs, are those maintenance needs met? Will it provide enough excess energy to actually get to marbling, or will it stop before it gets to marbling and we just see the development of that subcutaneous fat or the seam fat, but never see marbling development? And then if there are deficiencies, right? So if it's not getting to enough energy for intramuscular fat, or if it's not meeting maintenance need, what supplements or what management strategies might help to alleviate that from a forage management perspective? And as we wrap up, I think as a person who studies meat science and who really studies the things that happen on the live animal end and the impacts they have on the carcass and the yield of the carcass, as well as the quality of the carcass, we've talked a little bit about the science. We've recognized the art that you all practice who raise animals. And I think at the end, it really is balancing those two. So we can take all of the genetic variables that exist on the front side. We talked a lot about mama cow, mama pig nutrition, everything that happens there as it relates to what's going on during pregnancy and the impacts that has on the development of these individual cells. And then everything that happens post-birth that yields to carcasses that may act or look very differently as a reflection of nutrition, of use of the muscle, of location of the muscle, all of these different variables. It's balancing lots of different things. And so taking into account the art that is practiced in reality, as well as the scientific underpinnings, all of these physiological and biological things that happen beneath the surface that are impacting the end product, which ultimately we hope is going to yield an eating experience that's desirable to a consumer. So building that high quality carcass, creating high quality meat starts at the cellular level, ends at the rail. And it's important for us as an entire industry to really have an understanding of the science, and certainly a respect for the art that you all practice, and then work towards combining both of those to perfect that balance so we can consistently produce eating experiences that our consumers will desire. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Well, we have some great questions, but I do want to sort of address one thing. So a recording will be sent out in a follow-up email, and usually I try and do that within 24 hours, but that is just not going to happen this week because, like I said, I'm processing turkeys, and I went to market this morning, and I still haven't had my after-market nap, and I need my after-market nap. So I will certainly do that. But it probably will be when I come back to work on Wednesday. So I apologize if that's going to make anybody feel crazy. But we have some great questions, Jennifer. I'm going to start with the ones in the Q&A. And if you put your question in the chat, would you mind copying and pasting it and putting it in the Q&A? So Joe had a question, and this is from earlier on when you were talking about pH decline. And Joe would like to know why, what helps that decline, and why is that important?
Yeah, great question. So what things that can help the pH decline are simple things such as temperature of the carcass post-harvest. So after an animal is harvested, because they no longer have a blood supply, their body temperature goes up pretty quickly. And so temperature can play a role in making sure that that pH decline happens. The other things that can play a role in pH decline is stress prior to harvest. So when we think about when an animal is alive, just like when we're alive, our muscles are using oxygen. So our blood is flowing, we're taking oxygen to the muscles. That oxygen is being utilized as an energy source in the muscles. When the blood flow stops and the supply of oxygen stops, the muscles switch from what we call an oxidative metabolism using oxygen to one where they use reserves of glycogen or a sugar for energy, because they're still doing things as a postmortem muscle. And so those stores of glycogen are really important because they need glycogen in order for that pH decline. But one of the things that we see really common in animals is that those stores of glycogen can go down before harvest. And one of the ways in which those stores of glycogen can go down is stress prior to harvest. So if an animal is really stressed before its harvest, all of the extra energy it has to decline the pH after the blood flow is lost are gone. And so after they're harvested, the pH doesn't decline. And we'll see such things as really dark meat or really dry meat that can result in some really extreme off flavors. So that's probably the biggest way that we see that pH decline happen, is it's a natural biological process that the animal goes through. It's associated with rigor mortis, and it only happens if they have energy sources that aren't oxygen after they're harvested. Great question.
Cool. Yeah, I'm a cheesemaker as well, and so there's a lot of pH. You want that? Yeah, you're always focused on pH and cheese development. So Joe actually has a follow-up question. I don't know if it's a follow-up question. A second question: is there any known way to ensure increased development of fat cells before birth?
Yeah, a lot of that. I wish there were. I think it's one, good management. So making sure gestational management and gestational nutrition are important. And then genetics. So there are certain animals, like if you're tracking how animals perform, we know that genetics play a role in the ability of an animal to marble. And so if you have an animal that, from a genetics perspective, their offspring tend to marble well, that should continue, but it's making sure that you have the nutritional plane to maximize the genetic potential. So with the combination of both, that's really the best you can do, is making sure that the genetic potential is there and the nutritional plane fulfills that genetic potential.
Okay. I think we answered a couple of these. You answered them as you were going along. So somebody asks, does forage composition also affect texture?
It can, and specifically usually as it relates to the development of, or the differentiation of muscles. And so if we think about, so I guess in two ways, if it results in meat that is not marbled well, then that can have an impact on texture. It can make muscles seem more tough than they are. We think about marbling as being from a texture perspective, it's not truly associated with increasing in tenderness, but it can increase or decrease the density of meat because we're breaking up muscle fibers with fat fibers. So that can have an increase in, or have an impact on texture. Depending on when the forage was fed, there are certain, if it's not helping to differentiate muscles or to develop connective tissue to group muscles together, then we can see impacts there. But I think most of it's associated with marbling development as it relates primarily in that particular case to the density of the muscles, as well as when you're chewing the meat, any fat development inside of the muscle lubricates your mouth and makes it easier to chew. So it gives a perception of a better texture or increased tenderness.
We have a question here, and I guess Rob wants you to discuss the leptin effectiveness on true tenderness.
So leptin's effects on tenderness, are you talking about, I would need clarification if you're talking about prenatal leptin exposure, like gestational leptin, or postnatal, like post-birth?
Rob, if you want to add that at the end, at the end of the question, the Q&A, we'll see if we can get to it. Okay. Somebody asks, if a cow is fed grain during the winter, then goes to a grass forage during the warmer months, how long will that marbling stick with them?
Yeah, that's a great question. It really depends on the diet, the composition of the diet, and the energy level of the forage-based diet. If we see animals that the nutritional plane decreases, then we'll start to see fat deposits go away. So they can lose marbling and they can lose other fats because they're needing that for energy reserves or energy resources. So it would depend on assuming, right? If we assume that the grain-based energy level was the same as the forage-based energy level, they should hold on to the fat they have. All that may change is that forage is going to change the composition of the fats, and then we may see those flavor impacts take over.
Right, which is a forage-based person myself. I think it's a wonderful thing to have those flavors versus the corn. And so Danielle would like to know some resources you would recommend. If you could follow up with me with some resources, I'll send that out in the email I'm sending out next week, or if you have any particular resources you would like to share. Does that sound good,
Yeah,
Jennifer?
I can do that. Sorry, I was about to cough, so I was trying not to cough.
Okay. And this is Bridget, I'm with you on this. There's always a debate about the best cattle breed. What is your opinion regarding genetics? And I would like to, for one of the things, so we raise dairy cows, we raise Jerseys, and then we also sell them for meat, and they've got a great flavor profile, but they do not marble very well. So if you could sort of like tie that into there as well, get your questions in there with one.
Yeah, I think it depends on what your definition of best is. If we're thinking about best being an animal that is going to be high quality grading, yield a high quality grading carcass, then historically the Angus breed is one that has a lot of genetic potential, to do that. That's one goal, right? There are plenty of challenges with that breed as it relates to cutability or yield and other things. One of the ones that, like, I guess from a personal perspective, I find a lot of, so you mentioned Jerseys, Holsteins marble really, really well. And so I think dairy breeds have lots of value to the beef industry as it relates to whether it's a pure, a straight bred dairy animal or some sort of cross with a beef animal or a beef breed. We're seeing lots of folks who are starting to introduce dairy breeds into beef breeding systems, specifically Holsteins, because they do marble so well. So I personally find that really interesting because there's some reasons from a animal biology and physiology perspective why dairy animals or Holstein animals particularly seem to marble better. So I think there's a lot of value, and so I might say that they're one of the best breeds because they introduce some things that are valuable that some of the other breeds don't. But I really think it depends on what your definition of best is. If you're truly seeking marbling, the tried and true Angus breed is known to marble well, but it is certainly not without fault. So I shy away from calling it best because I think there are plenty of challenges with it.
Well, that is fantastic. We went 10 minutes over, Jennifer. I'm so sorry taking up your time, and everybody else in the audience taking up your time as well. But there was so much great information. You're amazing. I'm glad I stalked you for the rest of that conference trying to get you to come on. You answered our questions. We'd love it. I've actually just put up a poll. If you guys wouldn't mind answering that, that would be fantastic. That really helps us with our reporting and all that other kind of stuff. And while you're answering that poll, I'm just going to go ahead and give thank you, Jennifer, so much for all the hard work you put into this. I know you've done it multiple times, but still, there was so much information and so much to get from this, the information that you've shared. It's just absolutely